The American philosopher Alfred North Whitehead famously said, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." Ralph Waldo Emerson said, even more simply, Plato is philosophy, and philosophy is Plato. And a third great thinker, the old professor in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, said, "It's all in Plato, all in Plato. Dear me, what do they teach them in the schools nowadays anyway?" That's a pretty good summary of the main point of these lectures. The Platonic tradition in Western philosophy is not just one of many equally central traditions. It is so much the central one that the very existence and survival of Western civilization depends on it. It is like the Confucian tradition in Chinese culture, or the monotheistic tradition in religion, or the human rights tradition in politics. In this first lecture, I shall define Platonism and its big idea, the idea of a transcendent reality that the history of philosophy has labeled Platonic ideas or Platonic forms. In the second lecture, we'll briefly explore Plato's two basic predecessors or sources, Greek myth and Socrates, and then we'll look at the applications of the forms in Plato's own dialogues. The third lecture will cover the three most important footnotes to Plato himself in the Platonic tradition, Aristotle, Plotinus, and Augustine, each of whom gave the forms a new metaphysical address. The fourth lecture will explore 6 Christian Platonists, 3 in the New Testament and 3 philosophers. The next 3 lectures will explore the consequences of the modern abandoning of Platonism, beginning with William of Ockham's nominalism as the source of nearly all modern philosophical errors. And in the 6th lecture, we'll look at 13 influential kinds of positivism or reductionism in modern thought. And lecture 7 will look at the results of abandoning the Platonic tradition in ethics, the values vacuum, or nihilism. And in the last lecture, we'll look at some experiential evidence for Platonism, some doors out of Plato's cave that are still open, some signals of transcendence. All this in 8 short lectures? Well, yes, it's a tiny sample of an enormous and commodious storehouse, something like a wine tasting party. It's meant to begin your thinking and reading, not to end it. Any philosophy is a work of art. Every great work of art must have a central unity. That's why almost every great philosopher has one big idea, one great central idea, a kind of hub from which all the other ideas radiate like spokes. For Plato, this is the so-called theory of ideas, or theory of forms, though both terms are misleading, for they're not ideas in anybody's mind, they're not concepts, and they're not geometrical forms, shapes, or appearances. They're objective truths, objective realities that are not visible to the eye of the body, but only of the mind. But the mental eye that sees them is not merely the eye of reasoning or intelligence in the narrow modern sense, but the eye of contemplation or intellectual intuition. There's a third reason it's misleading to call it Plato's theory of forms, because it's not a theory, first of all. It's an insight. It's a sudden, almost mystical experience. Mystical in the sense that it's an insight into something absolute, but it's not mystical in the sense of being irrational. In fact, it's supremely rational. This single big idea that defines Platonism could be called the theory of big ideas, because the Platonic ideas are bigger than any ideas inside of minds, and also they're bigger than concrete material things outside of minds. They're bigger than both of us, bigger or realer than either concepts or things. They are the standards or patterns for all concepts and all things, and they account for the unity between concepts and things. For instance, our ideas of justice or squareness or humanness can correspond to just things or square things or human things only because both our ideas and those things participate in the same Platonic form, justice or squareness or humanness. This big idea of Plato's is most famously expressed in the Republic, the single most famous book in the history of philosophy. Books become famous and remembered because they're loved. And the Republic is loved, I think, not for its politics, which are absurd, but for its psychology, which is the world's first, by the way, and above all for one short passage, the most famous in the whole history of philosophy, the parable of the cave, in which Plato invites us to come with him out of our small, comfortable, conventional little shadowland into a startlingly larger world outside this cave, and see those realities of which these shadows are shadows. When we do that, we will at first certainly be confused and blink when we first see this sunlight. The reaction of my students to Plato's theory of ideas is typically that of Horatio to Hamlet when he first sees the ghost whom he did not previously believe in. While Horatio is in this amazed state of mind, Hamlet says to him, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed of in your philosophy." That's the essential point of Platonism: moreness, transcendence, another kind of reality outside our cave. The tendency of typically modern thought is just the opposite: reductionism, debunking, demythologizing, that there are fewer things in heaven and earth, that is, in objective reality, than in our philosophies. The modern tendency is to contract, to reduce. And I think the reason for this is clear. Only when we reduce the complex to the simple and the mysterious to the clear can we comprehend it scientifically and conquer it technologically. That's our essential modern project, our main claim to fame, our great success story. Plato's project is the opposite: not to conquer things by making them smaller, but to let ourselves be conquered by something greater. Modern scientific truths are like poker chips with which we can calculate and win. Our mind encloses such truths and uses them. They work, and they work very well. But Plato's truth is like a cathedral, which we humbly bow to enter. It encloses us, we do not enclose it. But when we bow, we become taller, and we feel we are in a larger world when we are in a cathedral, or in Plato's philosophy. The Platonic ideas are not in our mind, we are in them. They are not our servants, they are our masters. That's why we experience awe and wonder at them. Most philosophies don't have that power over our souls. When we speak of awe and wonder, we don't usually think of modern philosophers. But I've described only the psychological effect of the idea that I've labeled the heart of Platonism. Can we be a little more specific about what it means? We can define it in three different ways, either very broadly or very narrowly or somewhere between those two extremes. Very broadly, it means what the Greeks called logos, and what we might translate as order. That reality has an internal order, an intelligibility, a system, that it makes sense. That order is not just our invention, our minds imposing structure and meaning, but that it's really there, in everything. It's discovered rather than invented. Things are ordered because they have intelligible natures or essences. That primary question, what is it, has real answers. Reality is intelligible to mind. Being is open to reason, and reason is open to being. That's the broad way of defining it. The narrow way of defining it is the way that most history of philosophy textbooks do it. It means that there are always universals over particulars. That redness and holiness and chairness are just as real as red things and holy things and chairs. That adjectives are real just as nouns are. That when two or more things have the same quality, that quality is as real as the things, and in fact is real independent of the things, so that if all holy men perished, holiness would still be holiness, and if all the red things in the universe perished, redness would still be, though it would not be anywhere in the universe. A third definition of Plato's theory of forms is that visible, concrete, particular things are images or reflections of their pure forms or Platonic ideas or essences. They are like them or analogous to them. That the whole world that we see here in our cave is a series of shadows of more real things. We live in the Shadowlands. That was the title of the C.S. Lewis movie. A perfect title because that Platonic insight was Lewis's own essential philosophy. The whole world we see is an image of a world we do not see, as a painting is an image of something in the painter's mind. When we see a painting, our mind forms an image of it, but the painting itself is an image of an idea in the painter's mind. The easiest way to understand this is to think of the painter as God and the painting as the universe. So the whole material universe is a great work of art, and our understanding of the ideas that it reflects is a kind of mental telepathy with the mind of the artist. I've used the language of religion because that makes Platonism clearer, even though Platonism is not a religion. Plato, like Socrates, was a monotheist, but he was quite agnostic about the divine mind, and he nowhere says that it is the single divine person. That identification was a step made later by Christian Platonists. That goes beyond Plato, but not necessarily against him. This higher world, or realm, or dimension, this world of forms, is eternal, while the world of concrete things is temporal and changing. Living things like trees, or round things like bubbles, or just things like societies come into being and pass away, but life does not, and roundness does not, and justice does not. A second difference is that living things, or round things, or just things are many, while life is one, and roundness is one, and justice is one. A third difference is that life and roundness and justice are perfect, perfectly round, or perfectly just, while round bubbles are always a little bumpy instead of perfect spheres, and just societies are always mixed with some injustice. C.S. Lewis explains Platonism in The Allegory of Love by calling its worldview symbolism and contrasting it to allegory. He writes, "It is the very nature of thought and language to represent what is immaterial in picturable terms. What is good or happy has always been high like the heavens and bright like the sun. Evil and misery were deep and dark from the first. To ask how these married pairs of sensibles and insensibles first came together would be great folly. The real question is how they ever came apart." This fundamental equivalence between the immaterial and the material may be used by the mind in two ways. On the one hand, you can start with an immaterial fact, such as the passions which you actually experience, and can then invent visibilia to express them. This is allegory. But there is another way of using the equivalence, which is almost the opposite of allegory, and which I would call symbolism. If our passions, being immaterial, can be copied by material inventions, then it is possible that our material world, in turn, is the copy of an invisible world, of something else. The attempt to read that something else through its sensible imitations, to see the archetype in the copy, it is what I mean by symbolism. The allegorist leaves the given, his own passions, to talk of what is confessedly less real, a fiction. The symbolist leaves the given, the material world, to find that which is more real. Symbolism comes to us from Greece. It makes its first appearance with the dialogues of Plato. The sun is the copy of the good. Time is the moving image of eternity. All visible things exist just insofar as they succeed in imitating the forms. I gave you that rather long quotation from C.S. Lewis because it's a perfect juxtaposition of Platonism versus the more modern tendency. Plato's theory of forms is the central doctrine of the Republic. The Republic is usually classified as a book about politics. But Plato clearly says in the Republic that he's going to deal with politics only as an analogy, a parallel or illustration for ethics, for morality. He wants to see the morally good man and good life more clearly by looking at the good society, because society is bigger and easier to see. So politics is only the Republic's means. Ethics is its end. And the most fundamental differences between any two philosophical positions in ethics and also in politics are always rooted in fundamental differences in metaphysics, which is the division of philosophy that deals with the nature of reality. Ethics and politics deal with the good, private and public. Metaphysics deals with the real. But goodness and reality cannot be separated. The ought depends on the is. Values depend on facts, on truth, especially the truth of human nature. Let me try to make that same point in another way. You can answer the ethical question, what should we be and do, individually and socially, what is the good life and the good society, only if you answer the prior anthropological question, what is a human being? Is humanity merely a lucky cosmic accident, a fortunate arrangement of molecules, a chemical equation, an evolved slime pool, an animal which has learned to wear clothes? Is the mind merely the brain? Or, the opposite extreme, is man really God in disguise, or a god, or an angel? Or maybe is man a double thing, half beast and half angel? Or something between beast and angel? But you can answer this anthropological question, what is man, only if you answer the prior metaphysical question, what is real, what is reality? If spirit does not exist, we cannot be a spirit or a god or an angel, and if matter does not exist, that's the only thing we could be, material. And involved in all of these questions, the question of metaphysics and anthropology and ethics and politics, is also another question, the question of epistemology. How can we know these things? Let me put the point in still another way, the point about ethics depending on metaphysics. When you read the Republic, you probably wish you could ask this question of Plato. Plato, your picture of the good life in the Republic, both the good society and the good individual, this may be a beautiful and noble ideal, but is it real? There never has existed a perfectly good, perfectly just state, or a perfectly good, perfectly just individual. So isn't your ideal just that, your ideal, your personal opinion, subjective? It's in your mind, and maybe it's in mine too, but is it real? Aren't these Platonic ideas merely your ideas? How can they be part of the real world? The typically modern view is that the real world is merely the world we can see and touch, the world we can know best by science, the objective world, and that there's also a subjective world, an inner world of our private, personal thoughts and opinions and feelings, which we change as often as we change our clothes. So there are two worlds, the world without and the world within. The world of objective material things that we can have opinions and desires about, and the world of those subjective spiritual opinions and desires. Now, both of these two worlds change, and both of these two worlds are imperfect. They get better or worse. They're never perfect. Now, if this typically modern metaphysics is true, then what follows for ethics? Ethics, then, is a matter of subjective ideals, values that we posit, that we create. Values are not like rocks. We don't discover them. They're like art. We create it, both individually and socially, or culturally, or collectively. You see, if the typically modern metaphysic is true, there are only two places for the good to be: in the objective material world of rocks, or in the subjective spiritual world of opinions and feelings. And since values aren't material things like rocks, they must be subjective opinions or feelings. But Plato thinks they are things like rocks. They're objectively real, though they're not material. In fact, they're harder than rocks, realer than rocks, more unchangeable, more unyielding than rocks. But we don't see them with the eyes of the body. We see them with the eyes of the mind. But they're not in the mind any more than rocks are in the eye. This fundamental metaphysical difference between Plato and modernity is the root of a fundamental ethical difference. In the typically modern view, Plato is an unrealistic dreamer, and Thrasymachus the sophist is right when he defines justice as simply the label pinned on the laws by whoever has the power to make them. So might makes right, literally. Justice is ultimately power. That's what Thrasymachus argues in the Republic, and what Machiavelli much later argues in The Prince. Now, even if you prefer a less violent and freer and more democratic definition of justice, let's say as the consensus of free citizens rather than the imposition of raw power, still, it's metaphysically in the same position. It's only subjective. It's man-made. It may be good, but it's not true. It's not real. Plato wants to expand that narrow world, that cave of ours, in metaphysics by showing us a different kind of reality outside the cave, and in epistemology by showing us a different kind of knowing than cave knowing, a knowing that he calls wisdom, and in anthropology by showing us our new identity, our hidden soul power to transcend the cave, and in ethics by showing us another kind of good, a good and a goal and an end and a destiny that transcend the cave. Plato isn't creating this new world like a fantasy writer. He's describing it like Columbus describing America. Plato isn't expanding the real world. He's showing us that we've contracted it by creeping into our cave. So Platonism is not comfortable. If we follow Plato's lead and emerge from the cave, it will look to us at first like a contraction of the world because we'll lose something. We'll lose control. We'll stand blinking and confused in the sun. And there's another danger. When we eventually stop blinking and learn to see in the sunlight and come to know this greater world, we may then denigrate the lower world, for we will know that this lower cave world is only a shadow, an image of the greater, better, higher world. But it's a real image, and it's a precious image because of what it's an image of, so that danger can be avoided, and of course should be avoided. You can take two attitudes to an image once you realize it's only an image. You can say, oh, it's only an image, not the real thing, so out with it. Or you can say, that's an image of something great and precious, so that makes it a precious image, like a photo of your beloved. There is another typically modern objection to Plato's invitation to go with him on his journey out of the cave, and many of you are probably thinking this objection right now. It comes down to this: even if you choose to follow Plato, isn't that choice as subjective as your taste in art or music? Plato offers us two options, two philosophies, cave light or sunlight, and we must choose. But you might argue that the fact that we must choose between these two philosophies means that philosophy is only in our minds. We might think that the choice between believing that the world outside the cave is only subjective or believing that it is objective is itself only subjective, only what I happen to like, or what my society or my religion or my philosophy teacher or my genetics and brain chemistry has caused me to like, rather than something as real as a rock. But if that's true, if our choice is purely our subjective preference and not objectively right or wrong, true or false, if it's not decided by reason but by some other force in nature or nurture, heredity or environment, if my rational intelligence is merely an effect of irrational matter and irrational desires, as Freud says, well, in that case, there's no real reason why I should believe any one idea rather than any other, including that idea. For if there are only causes and not reasons, if the material forces in the cave and the subjective forces inside my own mind are the only things that determine any of my ideas, if there are no Platonic ideas but only my ideas, then you see what follows. No idea I have can ever be known to be either true or false, any more than the pistons in your car engine are either true or false, or the row of dominoes that cause each other to fall are either true or false. They just are. It's just the way they work. In other words, there are only causes, not reasons. My psyche just happens to work that way. But if there's no spiritual designer and programmer behind my computer brain, why should I trust that computer? Freud is a good example of the anti-Platonist on this issue, the issue of the authority of reason, which is the vehicle that takes us out of the cave for Plato. Freud says on the last page of his most philosophical book, Civilization and Its Discontents, that the only thing he is certain of is that all our reasoning is only rationalizing of our desires. Now, it seems to me that that's the only sentence in the book that we can be absolutely certain is false, because it's self-contradictory. Because if that's true, then that piece of reasoning, too, is only rationalizing. So why should I believe it if it's only Freud himself rationalizing Freud's desires? Why should I let Freud's desires determine my beliefs? If reason is only subjective, then that piece of reason is only subjective too. It's only subjective that it's only subjective. So it refutes itself. It commits rational suicide. So reason must be in touch with objective truth, at least sometimes. If it wasn't, then we could have no standard for judging when it wasn't. If there's no real money, we have no right to judge that any money is counterfeit. If there's no ultimate truth, we can't judge any thought as erroneous. So some kind of thought, some kind of reason, must get outside the cave. Plato has to be right about that. That's just the logical argument, an abstract one. Here's another argument, a much more concrete and experiential one, for believing that Plato is right and that there is a world of eternal, objective, universal, absolute truth outside the cave of our sensations and opinions and their material objects. The argument is simply that we experience it. Our mind bumps up against the objective and unchangeable reality of 2 and 2 are 4, or triangles have 180 degrees, or justice is a virtue, or effects must have causes. Our body bumps up against real physical walls that we can't walk through, and our mind just as really and truly and unarguably bumps up against real walls of thought that it's simply impossible to knock down or change. Triangles and virtues are no less real than physical walls and rocks. If the truths of mathematics and metaphysics were merely mental, if we made them up, then we could change them, as we can change unicorns or mermaids or hobbits, but we can't. And the same is true of the laws of ethics. If justice were simply man-made, we could change it, just as we can change traffic laws, but we can't. We can't make genocide right or honesty wrong. We discover them. And where do we discover them? Where are they? In the world outside the cave. So this gives us a radically different anthropology. Plato defined man as the rational animal. Reason is what distinguishes man from the beasts. But what is reason? The typically modern answer is simply calculation, cleverness. But Plato's answer is wisdom, understanding, insight into the forms. In the Republic, he summarizes 4 levels of reason, parallel to 4 levels of reality, in a geometrical figure that he calls a divided line, a line divided into 4 unequal parts. The first and lowest level of knowledge is mere second-hand opinions based on reflections or images or second-hand reports of real things. The next level is direct sense experience, which he calls belief, because we believe or assume that our senses show us reality, but we don't prove that. And the level of reality that is the object of sensory belief is actual material objects. A third level is logical and mathematical reasoning, and its object is logical and mathematical truths, like the truths of geometry. These are quantitative, not qualitative, and they're hypothetical. They depend on other truths, as in logic all conclusions depend on their premises. Logic is if-then reasoning. The fourth and highest level is knowledge of the forms. This knowledge is not mere appearance or belief or hypothetical reasoning, but direct insight into an unchangeable form like justice or beauty or human nature or life. And it's this knowledge that makes man human, that distinguishes man from both beasts and computers. Beasts have senses that are often better than ours, and computers can do reasoning much more accurately and quickly than we can. So how are we more than apes equipped with cameras and computers? Animals with enhanced sensory powers, which is level 2 of Plato's line, plus enhanced reasoning powers, which is level 3. What can we do that neither animals nor computers can do? The answer is that we can understand eternal, necessary truths. We can know the essential natures of things. That's what it is to be human, that's what it is to be rational, and that's what it is to get out of the cave. Plato thus invites us into the discovery of a whole new world, a third world in addition to the world of matter and the world of subjective minds and ideas, namely the world of objective ideas, forms, essences, the eternally real and unchangeable natures of things. And this third world alone unifies the other 2 worlds because both reflect the same forms. Why can I know that balls are round? Because both the ball's roundness and my mind's concept of roundness participate in the same form, roundness. Why is my subjective judgment that 2 plus 2 equals 4 true of real rabbits and real rocks, because both my judgments and the rabbits and rocks reflect the same forms, and the same relationships between the form 2 and the form 4. My geometry can measure pyramids because both reflect the same form of triangularity. Because there is the same red in both the rose and my sense perception, I can see that the rose is red. But what is redness? Redness is not a rose, nor is it a perception. It's what I perceive in the rose. The rose has redness, but it isn't redness. It has some redness, but not all of it. That's why other things can also be red. But other colors can't be red. Colors themselves are forms. We can know all three of these worlds. We can know the forms, as well as the things in the world, and the opinions and sensations in our minds. Why? Why can I know objective truths that go beyond the senses, beyond red roses and round balls and 2 rabbits? Why can I know eternal and unchangeable facts like these, that wholes are greater than parts, and that justice is a virtue, and that nothing can come into existence without a cause? Because my mind is somehow in touch with the world of eternal forms, by a light from outside the cave. Ideas like truth and goodness and beauty are produced in my mind, but not by my mind. They're produced by the impact of something on my mind, something that seems like a meteor that comes down from outer space, or like an angel coming down Jacob's ladder from heaven. It doesn't come from the earth because it's not made of matter, and it doesn't come from my mind. It comes to my mind and judges my mind as right or wrong, depending on whether my mind reflects it and conforms to it or fails to do that. What kind of mind, what kind of consciousness is it that knows the forms? Platonism gives us an expanded epistemology, or theory of knowledge, as well as an expanded metaphysics, or theory of being. To see this, let's distinguish 5 kinds of knowing by what kind of wonder they begin with. The first would be ordinary, unreflective, undisciplined knowing, sense perception, and common sense. And its wonder is simply factual curiosity. Basically, that's the first 2 levels of Plato's divided line. The next level would be scientific knowing in the modern sense. It uses proof by empirical testing and mathematical measurement, and its end is technological power over nature. The standard for scientific hypotheses is, do they work? So the wonder that begins this knowledge is, I wonder what will work. What will work to give me the most power? Power of theoretical ideas and power of practical technology. And this wonder ends when the knowledge comes. It's simply a means to that end. A third level would be philosophical knowledge, knowledge of reasons and causes by logical reasoning, getting to the kind of thing Aristotle and Plato got to. Like science, philosophy begins in wonder, according to Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, and the wonder ends when the knowledge comes. Then it proceeds to another wonder. The difference between science and philosophy is that it's much harder to come to the end in philosophy. But unless you're a skeptic, it's at least possible. A fourth kind of knowing would be an adult version of the attitude a little child has at the world, contemplation of the truth for its own sake. And the wonder that begins this knowing is contemplative wonder, and this kind of knowledge ends in wonder as well as beginning in wonder. Finally, a fifth kind of knowledge is mystical. The myths suggest this, and Plato ends his most important dialogues with myths because nothing else can suggest it better. This is an active, actual experience of the ultimate, something like knowledge in the biblical sense, which meant sexual intercourse. It's a kind of ecstatic play. Ecstatic because you're out of yourself, out of self-consciousness, out of your ordinary mind, out of control. It's a kind of intellectual orgasm. And it's play because it has no practical end beyond itself. It is our end. Plato strongly suggests in many places, like his seventh letter and the Phaedrus and the Symposium, and what he says about the absolute good in the Republic, that this mystical knowledge, which cannot be put into words, is the whole point of philosophy, and indeed of human life itself. In addition to these expanded levels in metaphysics and epistemology, Platonism also gives us an expanded ethics or life view or practice to go with his expanded worldview or theory. The ethical consequence of Platonic forms can hardly be exaggerated, because for the ancients, ethics is fundamentally about something much more than laws and rights and duties. It's first of all about the single most important question you can possibly ask. What is the end of human life? What is the meaning of life? What is the greatest good, the summum bonum, the purpose of our existence? What ought I to be and do? And the answer to this question, of course, depends on metaphysics. If nature is the final reality, if matter and human minds are all that exists, then my meaning and end is here, in this world, the satisfaction of merely temporal needs. If, on the other hand, I know a reality greater than nature, then I can aspire to some sort of union with that, even in this life, and I can hope for a more perfect union with it after death. And even in this life, if I have some kind of participation in the supreme good that transcends time, then I can take that as my standard. I can hitch my wagon to a star and navigate the seas of time with my head in the clouds, even as my feet are on the ground or on the deck of the boat. If I can know the absolute good, I can judge relative goods by that standard, including my own soul and also my society. That's ultimately the reason why Plato wants philosophers to become kings, because the philosopher is not merely the clever scholar, but the wise sage who knows perfect justice, and therefore can judge among imperfect justices. He can judge the shadows in the cave by the light he has seen outside the cave. Thus Plato would argue that only a Platonist, or a supernaturalist, or a transcendentalist, whatever label you want to use, only he can justify radical rebellion, because only he can judge existing society by a higher standard, as the Jewish prophets did. He can let the good judge us instead of judging it. How could it judge us if it's only our fabrication? How can I impose my ideas or our ideas on you? I can't. But perhaps my ideas and yours can alike be judged by the ideas. If not, if we can't let God be God, then one of us has to play God to the other. Or else just be indifferent and skeptical and never go beyond tolerance. Theologically put, the alternatives to Platonism are idolatry or not giving a damn. Politically put, the alternatives to Platonism are tyranny or totalitarianism or terrorism, or else anarchy, what the hell. So, you see, no philosopher is more relevant to our contemporary world than old Plato. Where did Platonism come from? In our next lecture, we'll explore his two major sources, Greek myth and Socrates, and how this heritage permeates all of his dialogues.
This ends Lecture 1.